Okay. And then like if I have to memorize, I have to put so much more on that.
Hi, how are you?
You are cracking me up.
What did I do? Oh, because of my message? It's unintentional, and I was like, oh god.
No, but it comes back. That's what the lesson is. Is that it's
I know. It's like, have you realized the answers for me too?
no,
Well,
but it is.
But
But I know the reference.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, you run. I told Brian that I feel like my education's shaping up. I was like, I've still kept it. Yes. Like, our cultures from her last term where the econ institution.
So she's something like always. So that's what the she's
I want to meet.
Oh my god, you're gonna
Enjoy your charcuterie. I'll have to eat some noodles. I'll have to be crunchy. I know. It's soft and buttery. Like, how loud am I gonna make it?
I think soda's
Yeah, it's like
I will do my best.
Thank you.
The sun went away and I'm miserable again.
Like, I need to go find. Not saying anything.
Hiding.
Yeah. Where did you look at? Like, I googled it and they're like, that's insane. They're like, what are you asking? Yeah, it's like, this is all over Instagram. I think this was after, yeah, she's like, about like, do it yourself. Like,
I tried to think I went back to
I sat down the
Richard kept walking you and being like, oh yeah, like you cheated. I was
why? He was like, cheat is not the right way to pronounce it. So like, I was like, yeah, like, and he was like, so you shot that? And I was like, no. Like, he was talking.
He's like, oh, it's obvious.
I just like having like looked at my laptop the whole time. Why did I talk about cheating? I don't.
It was so, but he literally just like, and then he kept being like, oh, obviously they're she and lovers the whole time.
I was just trying to. I got like 9 in the morning.
Yeah, so like, it was late at 9:30, and he just kept pointing over.
I read you like,
You shit.
Okay, happy weekend. 1 week to go. So this is the last week of substantive new material. So next week will be a revision session, and there is nothing that you need to prepare for next week, so just show up. In fact, the only person who needs to prepare for next week is me, because we're still sort of finalising a few details. But next week you can just show up. Okay? So this week is called Perspectives on Climate Cooperation, and we are really looking at the international climate negotiations and efforts to cooperate on climate change internationally. And we start by basically going through the history of the international climate negotiations, going through the major treaties, the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, the Copenhagen Summit in 2009, the Paris Agreement in 2015, and a few other milestones since then. So I asked you to watch 3 videos before coming today. That really just goes through the history, including quite a long time spent on actually looking at the Paris Agreement legal document and talking about the important aspects of it. And all of this was essentially descriptive, right? So just describing what we've achieved and what we've not achieved. And the purpose of the class today is to move from describing to theorizing, right? To actually think about the theories that can help us explain essentially why climate cooperation has been difficult. I don't think that's a spoiler, right? I think you all know that it's been hard. And we might have achieved some things, but there are a lot of things we haven't achieved, most notably actually solving the problem. So let's talk about why it's been hard. And the assignment is very much connected to that. The assignment, though, is intended to get you to think about the system that we now have, right, the Paris Agreement, and attempts to implement it. Compare it with architectures that we previously had, most notably the Kyoto Protocol, and just really take a step back and think about, is this the right way to be trying to foster international cooperation on climate change, or is there a better way? That's what it's intended to do. So I'm going to be lecturing for the first more or less couple of hours, and then we'll do the assignment. So actually, before I do mini lecture 10.4, I did just slightly update 10.3, but I didn't really think it was worth recording another video about it, because it takes ages to record these videos. I make a little mistake, I have to do another take from the beginning. You can imagine how infuriated I get. So, for my own mental health, I just made a couple of additional slides, and we'll make a new video. Well, I'll make a new video when something great happens. So that'll be a nice problem to have, okay? But basically, the 2 COPs that happened after the previous video was recorded are COP29 in Baku and COP30 in Belém. And to keep a long story short, nothing incredibly significant happened at either of these COPs. Okay, Baku was a bit unlucky in the sense that it was 2 fossil fuel exporter host countries in a row, right? First we had the UAE, and then we went straight from the UAE to Baku. And the host country does have an effect on the agenda and how things are run, so that was kind of bad luck. What was agreed at Baku? Well, the climate finance goal was updated, so we have something now called the new collective quantified goal of at least $300 billion per year of climate finance for both mitigation and adaptation, private and public sources, for developing countries by 2035. Okay. Not enough by anybody's estimates, but an increase on the previous 100 billion. Negotiations around Article 6 on carbon market rules have finalised. Okay, that took a long time, right? That took like 8 or 9 years and multiple COPs to agree. But there was very little on actually strengthening emissions reductions. At Belém, a lot of the importance around the Belém COP was the need for countries to update their NDCs according to the stock take and ratchet process, right? So more than 100 countries updated their NDCs in the run-up to or at or after the COP, with a target year of 2035 for these new NDCs compared to 2030 for the first round, right? There was an agreement to triple adaptation finance, right? That's within the NCQG, and there was an ongoing row which has had no resolution on what the treaty would say about fossil fuel use, which you may or may not think is an important issue. So, not a lot happened in Baku and Belém in the broad scheme of things, but there's a summary for you. The other thing that obviously happened is this. So the US, as in the first Trump administration, the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement, but it also announced in January that it will not only leave the Paris Agreement, it will actually leave the UNFCCC, and that will make it the first country to ever do that, right? Because, as you'll know from mini lecture 10.1, the UNFCCC has nearly universal membership, and in itself, minimal obligations. But as a sort of symbolic exercise, in some ways, the US is also withdrawing from the UN. And this thing here will be in the back of our minds throughout this afternoon. Okay. So let us move on to mini lecture 10.4. Okay. So, as I said, what we want to do, we want to look at theories that can help us explain the successes and failures of the climate negotiations that I've described to you in the video material. And both because this is an economics course, first and foremost, and because this is a really important theory, we're going to start with game theory and the importance of free riding and the so-called tragedy of the commons in explaining why we are where we are. So the learning outcomes, so you know, some of you will have done some game theory in the past, many of you will not. So as usual, we're just going to make sure that everybody is on the same page about what game theory is. Then we are going to, and luckily, you can get quite far in thinking about climate change without doing really hard game theory. It's, you can get about 80% of the way there just by understanding the so-called prisoner's dilemma and how it would apply to climate change, I would argue. So we'll spend time looking at the prisoner's dilemma as originally stated, as literally a dilemma facing a pair of prisoners. We will make the link and show you how the same structure of game can help us think about climate change. We will then broaden the game from the very simple 2 players binary strategy choice into something more complicated, and that is where we will end up. I think there's some quite helpful overlaps here with GY426. I know that those of you who are doing GY426 are doing this kind of stuff this week as well. So I think there's some healthy overlap. I don't know whether EPR students are doing the prisoner's dilemma in GY465 or 475. Okay, well, that just means I have to do a good job, right? Okay, so to set the scene, as I've talked about at length in this week's materials, we've been talking about climate change for ages, and during that time, the emissions have just kept going up. So something is proving hard. So everything here starts with this foundational idea that climate change is an externality. Okay? And we talked way back in, I think, week 4 in relation to ethics about how climate change is a global externality, and that comes from the fact that greenhouse gases are well mixed in the atmosphere, right? So just drawing lots of connections across the course. You know from the science that greenhouse gases are well mixed in the atmosphere. That basic property of climate science is very important for the structure of the economic problem, because it means that when the emissions that I am responsible for are externalized and affect everyone around the world, not just me, not just people living in the same city as me or in the same country as me, but everywhere. Okay, so this is a truly global problem that crosses borders. And in that sense, we are not talking about the kind of environmental problem where a sovereign national government can just internalize it itself. As a global externality, we require multiple countries to cooperate to solve the problem. And the question is, given that in international relations, national sovereignty is key, and it's very difficult to compel countries to do what they don't want to do, except by force, then, which we don't want to use in the climate setting, right? Can we expect countries to be cooperative with each other? Or will they behave selfishly, and what is the consequence of that going to be? That is the key question here. Would we expect countries to cooperate with each other or not? And game theory is going to help us think about that. So game theory is a branch of economics. It's intended to look at situations where intended to look at the behavior of agents, which can be individuals or firms, or in this case, countries, in situations where their actions are interdependent. That's the key word here, interdependence. Specifically meaning, these are situations where, as an economic agent, I can make a decision, but the outcome of my decision does not just depend on my decision, it depends on the decisions of other people. So I cannot control the outcome, and I have to anticipate how others are going to behave, right? So game theory is a branch of economics that has been established to study these kinds of situations, and they're ubiquitous, right? Okay. So, one of the classic games in game theory is the so-called prisoner's dilemma. And it's going to be very important thinking about climate change, and so we'll just start there. Some of you will be very familiar with this, so you can kind of relax for a bit. Others will be seeing this for the first time, so don't relax, be very stressed. Okay, like the prisoner. Okay. So, the scenario here is 2 individuals commit a crime and they're later arrested by the police. The crime that I always like to talk about here is armed robbery. Okay? So here we have 2 armed robbers that have robbed a bank or something. And they're later the police are suspicious and they later arrest them. But they can't prove that the robbers robbed the bank. They have, say they found them with some money. They found them with bags full of cash. Right? But they can't prove they were there. Right? And the robbers, their initial response is to say, oh, my friend gave it to me. It's from my mum, I'm taking it to her later. Yeah. And so the police adopt a traditional interrogation tactic. We put the 2 prisoners in separate cells, interrogate them separately, without each prisoner knowing what the other prisoner is being asked and how they're answering, right? So that you can see already that's making it one of these games, right? Because each individual prisoner has to decide what to do without knowing how the other prisoner is behaving, yeah? And so the police, they put them in separate cells and they offer them the same kind of deal, plea bargain, right? It's one of these classic ones where they say that, if you cooperate with us, you will get a reduced jail sentence. The specific structure of the deal is as follows. So you can put yourself in the situation of one of these two robbers. So say, well, if you testify against the other prisoner, so if you say that they did it, and if you remain silent, so you say that, oh, I didn't do it, it was John, it wasn't me, John did it. Then you'll go free, and they're going to go to jail for 10 years. If you testify against the other prisoner and they testify against you, then there's a testimony that both of you were involved, so you're both going to go to jail for 5 years. The next one is just the opposite of the first one. So if you stay silent, the other prisoner testifies against you, you'll go to jail for 10 years, and they will get away free. And lastly, if you can both manage to stay silent, well, you've both been found with bags of cash. So we're going to put you in jail for a short time for handling stolen money. So this is the choice that you've got, right? There are 4 scenarios here, 4 outcomes, and you've got a binary choice here between testifying against the other prisoner or staying silent. So obviously the question is, what are you going to do? So who's going to testify against the other prisoner? And who's going to stay silent? And the rest of you are going to do It really is only 1, 2, there are only 2 choices here. So let's do that again. Who's going to testify? And who's going to stay silent? Well, let's look at the structure of this decision in another way, and we can establish what would be rational to do. Okay? So let us turn this information into a payoff table, payoff matrix, otherwise known in game theory as a normal form game. Okay? So you can see, so you've got the 2 prisoners on the axes. You've got their binary choices, sort of rephrased in terms of classic game theory. Testify or stay silent, defect or cooperate. You've got the payoffs from each of these 4 possibilities, and the question is, what should you do? Now, the assumption here is that you're going to do what's individually rational for you. Okay, that's an important assumption. Everything here is based on the idea of individual rationality. So we're not concerned about the outcomes for the other prisoner. We are, after all, armed robbers. Right? We're not altruists. Okay? So it's a good situation for thinking about individual rationality. The way you figure out how to what is individually rational in this case is you say, okay, I'm going to take what the other player, I'm going to take as given what the other player does, and I'm going to work out in each case what would be best for me to do. So let's say let's put you in the situation of prisoner A. And let's look at what you would do, conditional on what prisoner B chooses. It just involves me reading down the columns, but I could do it the opposite way and read it. Let us suppose that prisoner B stays silent, right? Cooperates in the sense of with the other prisoner. If prisoner B stays silent, what would be the best response of prisoner A? Defect. Testify. Okay? If, on the other hand, prisoner B testifies, what would be the best response of prisoner A? Defect. Testify. Yeah? So, whatever prisoner B does, prisoner A's best response is to testify, yeah? To defect. Which means that that is the dominant strategy here for prisoner A, sorry. And because this problem is symmetrical, that is also the dominant strategy for prisoner B. So both prisoners will end up defecting, will end up testifying against each other. And this is the outcome that you will get. Right? And this outcome is an equilibrium because once you're in this outcome, it's not in either prisoner's interest to deviate from their choice. Right? And no other solution here is in equilibrium, because if we're in any of the other quadrants, the two prisoners will have an incentive to deviate. That is what also makes this decision a so-called Nash equilibrium. If you're interested in game theory, you might have heard of John Nash, might have heard of the concept of the Nash equilibrium. So, this is the prisoner's dilemma game, as more or less originally formulated. The one other thing I want to say about it at this point is that you can see that this is not a zero-sum game. You often hear that term used when describing problems of cooperation. And it has a very specific sense here. It means that there is an outcome which would have been collectively better for the two, which is if they could have agreed to both stay silent. They would only have been in jail for a collective 1 year, 6 months individually. Yeah? But they couldn't cooperate to deliver this Pareto efficient outcome, right? Think back to week 4, right? This is the Pareto efficient outcome here, the one that would maximize the collective welfare of the two prisoners, but they are unable to attain it given the structure of this game. Okay. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, that was either interesting or, yeah, I knew that. What has that got to do with climate change? Well, the answer is, I can reframe this problem in terms of the costs and benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So instead of thinking about two prisoners, I think about two countries. And instead of thinking about testifying or staying silent, I think about, to start with, about a binary choice of whether to cut emissions or not. So that's the first leap of the imagination here. Let's just reframe this problem in terms of two countries, choosing in a very simple way whether to cooperate on climate action or not. And then the real key here is putting numbers in the matrix. So let's think about the structure of the payoffs here. So let's assume that emissions abatement costs 7 units. Right? It doesn't matter exactly what number I pick here. I'll come back to this in a moment. But let's just assume it costs 7. And let's assume that the benefits of reducing emissions are 10. So great, the benefits are greater than the costs, right? But the problem here is that because climate change is a global externality, those benefits are shared, 5 to each country. So each country is being asked to pay 7, but only enjoys private benefits of 5. The other 5 go to the other country. Now, given those assumptions, you can verify for yourselves that if you calculate the payoffs, you will get these numbers, right? And then, let me ask you the question again. Supposing B choose to cut emissions, what is country A's best response? Don't cut. Supposing B's decision is not to cut emissions, what is country A's best response? Don't cut, right? So again, don't cut is a dominant strategy, don't cut is a Nash equilibrium, and we have the prisoner's dilemma, but now applying to climate change. And it's the order of the payoffs, by the way, which makes it a prisoner's dilemma game. I told you the exact numbers don't matter, but they don't matter insofar as long as the order of the payoffs is the same in terms of in which cells A and B get their highest payoff, their next highest payoff, their second lowest payoff, and their lowest payoff. As long as that ordering is preserved, this will always be a prisoner's dilemma game. Okay? Once you change the ordering of the payoffs, you change the character of the game. We don't want to change the character of the game. It's not what we're trying to do here. So, we've got this far, we've essentially established, hopefully, that climate action seems to bear some kind of resemblance to a prisoner's dilemma game. And the problem with a prisoner's dilemma game is that the rational strategy is not to cooperate. So if countries are behaving in an individually rational manner, like an armed robber, say, then we will get into a bad equilibrium in which countries are not working together on climate change. And it is, to repeat, this is not a zero-sum game. They would collectively and individually be better off if they could both agree to reduce emissions. But not knowing what the other country is going to do, they will rationally defect. And the reason why climate change can look like this is this global externality aspect. It's the fact that the benefits are divided between the two players, whereas the costs are shouldered individually, which makes it so. So each of these countries has an incentive to free ride. We can use that language here as well, an incentive to free ride on the efforts of the other country. The best possible outcome for each country would be, in fact, if it could do that, right? If it could get the other country to reduce emissions to be like a Europe, while the country in question is not doing anything. Any questions to this point? Well, if you think of any, just put your hands up. So this is still pretty simplistic. So next thing that we would like to do is we would like to make it look more like a real world, the real world climate problem. So, I mean, in some ways that's what the whole of this afternoon is about, but we can take a first baby step towards doing that in the following way. Let's recognize that the world comprises more than two countries. So let's try to go from 2 players to large N players, to an arbitrarily large number of players. And if we were thinking about countries, we might say that's 200, because that is about the number of countries in the world, but it's always changing. And let us also generalize from a binary strategy choice of either cut emissions or don't cut emissions to a continuous strategy choice of cut emissions from 0 to 100%. Yes?
In the more realistic game, can you also change how you act based on how other people act? Because you're not in a vacuum where you can know whether other people are abated or
Yeah,
not.
so we're going to continue in a static game setup, which means that the short answer to your question is you have to make a one-off decision under uncertainty about what other players are going to do. But after that, we can, I wasn't going to, but we can have a discussion about, we can talk about, at least talk about so-called repeated games, okay? Where agents interact. This is really for this is just a reminder that I need to talk about this, so if I don't remind me of it. This is a situation where players in a game interact repeatedly, so they have an opportunity to observe the behavior of other players, like countries, over multiple interactions, right? We can talk about that. I don't really want to get into genuinely dynamic games, because that's the most terrific part of economics. So let's do this first step. And I'm drawing a lot from Scott Barrett's 1994 paper, Strategic Behavior. I can't remember what it's called. Something like Strategic Behavior in International Environmental Treaties, something like that. It'll also be on the GY426 reading list. If you want to dig deeper into the maths of this, or just get a bit more background, you should go there. But it's not necessary. It's not necessary to read that paper, I think, to understand the main points. Okay, so we're going to start. We're going to start by just looking at two possible solutions to this multiplayer decision problem with a continuum of abatement levels that you can choose. We're going to look at non-cooperation and full cooperation. Either way, we're going to set this problem up in a way that will be familiar to you from week 7, where we talked about marginal cost functions and marginal benefit functions. Okay? So here we have an arbitrarily large number of countries. Like the two-player game, we're still going to think of these countries for now as being identical. I know that countries are not identical, but thinking of countries for the moment as being identical strips away a lot of unnecessary complexity around the actual differences between countries and just allows us to laser in on this free riding incentive. Okay? So that's why we're doing this. Okay? So just bear with me. That's why we're making this unrealistic assumption that countries are identical. It's just to clear away unnecessary detail. So we've got a set of an arbitrarily large number of identical countries, each of which faces this marginal cost curve. So this is a MAC curve, right? So remember the McKinsey MAC curve? So this is a stylized representation of that for country I. And all countries are identical, so this function is the same. This curve is faced by all countries. Right? Now, when each country reduces emissions, it does provide some benefits to itself. Okay? So that is represented by the marginal benefit function MB sub I, where on the vertical axis, just take a step back, we have cost or money, and on the horizontal axis we have emissions abatement. So as we go more to the right, we cut emissions more. That's why the marginal benefit function is downward sloping and the marginal cost function is upward sloping. So this is the marginal benefit function for country I. It's the same for all countries because they're symmetrical. Now, when each country reduces its emissions, you'll know from the two-player game that they provide benefits for all countries. Yeah. So that means that the collective marginal benefit function for all countries is this higher function MB, which is going to be literally the number of countries n times MB sub I, yeah, because they're all identical. And because the number of countries n is larger than 1, clearly this curve is going to be higher. This curve, the collective marginal benefit function, is going to be higher than the individual marginal benefit. And now we want to think about how much will each country reduce emissions either under non-cooperation, meaning that each country is just solving its own private benefit maximization problem, ignoring the outcomes for other countries, versus the situation where countries are cooperating fully. So in the former situation, it should be obvious to you that country I is going to reduce emissions just up to the point where its marginal cost function equals its marginal benefit function. You'll be familiar with this way of thinking from back in week 7, yeah? And that's going to give this amount of emissions reduction Zn, a non-cooperative abatement level. If, on the other hand, we have full cooperation, then countries are going to reduce emissions up to the point where their marginal cost function equals the global marginal benefit function, and that's going to take us over here to ZC, right? So that's emissions abatement under full cooperation, and you can see that full cooperation gives you more emissions reduction than non-cooperation. So, voila, we already have the multiplayer continuous strategy version of the original result, in the sense that the non-cooperative solution will give less emissions abatement than the full cooperative solution, with the gap between these two solutions depending on 3 parameters, right? What are those 3 parameters? There are only 3 parameters that matter here. Just to see if anybody can figure that out.
Maybe the end, so how many countries and each slope?
Yes, exactly. There are only 3 parameters that matter here. The number of countries, n, the slope of the marginal benefit function, and the slope of the marginal cost function. And those things collectively will determine the position of the two solutions, won't they? Now, in the multiplayer setting, we do have an additional complication, which is that non-cooperation and full cooperation are not the only possible outcomes of this game. Right? We want to open up the possibility of partial cooperation. Some countries forming a treaty and other countries staying out of the treaty. So that's the next stage of the story. Right? We want to think about what happens if we allow for the possibility that we're not at either extreme here. We're not just seeing no countries cooperating with each other or all countries cooperating with each other. We'd be interested to know that if countries could form a treaty, how many countries would take part in that treaty, and once in the treaty, how ambitious would they be about reducing emissions? So that's what we're going to do now. So the first 2 points I just said. So the next point is this. There are, in the literature, there are different ways to think about this problem, partial cooperation. Probably the simplest and the most common one, anyway the one I'm going to use, is to cast this as a problem of coalition formation. This is how Barrett cast this problem. This is what makes his paper such a significant contribution to the literature, because it was his intellectual insight that he could borrow a model, namely coalition formation, developed by economists to think about the formation of cartels. He could borrow that model and use it to help think about signing international environmental treaties. Right? That's a big insight, and that's what he did. So a classic model of coalition formation basically has 2 stages. There is a so-called membership stage first, and in that stage a country decides whether it wants to sign a treaty or not. And having signed the treaty, there is then the emission stage. So that is where countries who sign the treaty decide how much they're going to reduce emissions by solving the full cooperative problem, right? Presumably they want to sign the treaty because they want to cooperate. So the countries inside the treaty solve the full cooperative problem, and the countries outside the treaty solve the non-cooperative problem. That's how we're going to think about this. So we're going to get some kind of mixture of the full cooperative and the non-cooperative solution here, because we're going to allow countries to opt in to a treaty within which they will solve the full cooperative problem, or they can stay out, in which case they're going to continue to be in the world of non-cooperation. We want to know how many countries are going to opt into that treaty, and having opted in, how much are they going to do? Now, at this point, the maths starts to get hard. So at this point, I'm going to start glossing over the maths and pretty much just jump to the solution. However, I do want to just comment on what would be the equilibrium conditions in this model to give you a solution. And they are very similar to the conditions that gave us a Nash equilibrium in the 2-player binary strategy game. They're kind of a development on that idea. So here the equilibrium conditions are that no signatory to the treaty could gain by withdrawing, and no non-signatory to the treaty could gain by joining. Once we have reached a situation where none of the people who've signed the treaty would rather get out, and none of the countries that have refused to sign the treaty would actually like to get in, we have an equilibrium treaty size and amount of emission reduction. Those are the equilibrium conditions in this case. And you literally solve the model by working out, countries which will do to maximise their utility subject to these equilibrium conditions. That's how you would write this down as a mathematical problem. So, I said I would jump over the maths now and just proceed directly to the results. So, what are we looking at here? So these are literally screen captures from the original Barrett paper. So we have in his paper he thinks about 100 countries, right? He said to you that there are about 200 countries in the world, but working with 100 has the advantage that dividing and multiplying by 100 is much easier to do than 200. Okay, so he just picks 100, and all the main insights can be delivered with 100 countries, and would survive if we just double that. Okay. What do we have on the two axes here? We have the slope of these two important functions, the MAC curve and the marginal benefit function. So going across the horizontal axis, we're increasing the slope of the MAC curve. So just skipping back a couple of slides, we're going to be rotating this curve upwards. Yeah? And similarly, go down the axis, we're going to be increasing the slope of the marginal benefit curve. That means we're going to be rotating this curve upwards. And I said there were three important parameters in this model. The other one is the number of countries. Well, we've fixed that one. So this table is then telling you that for each combination of slopes, so you can sort of try to visually imagine that what's going on here is these things are varying, how many countries sign the treaty. And so we look at this, we say, okay, so we start over here in the top right. This is a situation in which it's super expensive to reduce emissions, and climate change is not a problem. And, as we would expect, we get a tiny coalition. Just have to get. I mean, these countries are identical, right? But we have it's an equilibrium when we have just two countries in the treaty. As we increase the slope of the marginal benefit function, we increase the number of countries in the treaty. As we decrease the slope of the marginal cost function, as we make climate action cheaper, we also increase the number of countries in the treaty. And down here in the bottom left, we have that when climate change is really cheap to fight, and the benefits of action on climate change are very large, climate change is a catastrophically important issue, then we have the grand coalition, all countries in the treaty. Okay? So we just stop at this point. We would think that, well, okay, this seems to be telling us a more positive story than the two-player binary choice game, or even the multiplayer continuous strategy game, assuming with non-cooperation and full cooperation, because it's telling us that countries sign the treaty when it matters, right? But I'm going to show you on the next slide that the story is not as positive as that. But first I can see a few hands popping up, so let's deal with this. So yes.
Yeah, I think I might have just missed something, but I don't quite understand why any countries would be joining on this side of the graph. Why are there even two? What are they getting?
Well, I think if you were to increase this beyond 100, the slopes, would that be fair? It's just the way the maths work out anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
But what is the benefit that they are getting? Make it make sense.
I think what this is just showing is that even for sort of extremely costly abatement and extremely low benefits, you still want to deliver a very tiny, almost vanishingly small amount of benefit. So you'll get a tiny, a minimal but not zero total.
Did I understand the game correctly that countries decide simultaneously if they want to be in or out of the coalition?
Yes.
But if countries are homogeneous, And why are there some that will join and others that won't? So wouldn't they all simultaneously decide, oh, this looks good to me?
No, it's like
So they would have to coordinate.
I get this question a lot, or it's a question that's asked a lot, right? So I think the key point here is that just because countries are symmetrical does not mean that they would all decide to do the same thing. It just means that the identity of the countries doesn't matter, right? The analogy I often fall back on here is the kind of volunteering dilemma, right? We suppose that you've got 100 people, and you have you're asking them if they're willing to volunteer to clean the litter in a park, right? Suppose all the individuals are identical, or at least the identities of the individuals don't matter. Pretty much irrespective of how the benefits and costs of collecting the litter, you're going to get some people taking part and some people not. Right?
So it's fun, so it's stochastic.
No, it's not. This is a fully deterministic.
I don't see how some then decide to do it and others not if they're homogeneous. Then there must be some irrationality on one part or the other.
No, it could be individually rational for the people who are inside. It will be, because these are equilibrium. It's just that the identity doesn't matter here. So just because they're symmetrical ex ante, it doesn't mean that they all decide to do the same thing. Yeah.
I get it. We assume every country is symmetric as a simple assumption, but I don't get why we can't assign a weight on the contribution, of emissions.
Oh, we can do, and we'll talk about that later. But it's just going to make this a whole lot harder to understand. Right? So it's just about stripping away everything until we look at the nature of the free rider. That's all it is. But you can start to introduce different benefit and cost functions. For the different countries, different shares of emissions. So we'll look at some of that stuff later.
Just very simple to understand the maths. Is it just the number of shares in? Is it basically based on how big the area of the triangle is of the loss, weight loss?
Yeah, pretty much. So I think we've dealt with, as far as I could, we've dealt with the questions raised to this point. As I said, where we've left it here is that we apparently have a positive story, right? So we apparently have a situation where the larger the benefits of climate action are relative to the costs, the more countries that we get into the treaty. But that is not the whole story. Okay, so because what we really want to understand is how much value the treaty is actually adding relative to non-cooperation. Because this just tells us how many countries are in, it doesn't tell us individually what they're doing and how much more they're doing than if we just assumed that there's no possibility to form a treaty. So that's the next thing we want to do. What are we doing here? We are choosing 3 out of the previous larger set of values for the slopes. Okay, we're choosing 0.01, 1, and 100. Okay. In each of the cells here, we are looking at not the number of signatories to the treaty, but the total amount of emissions reduced. Okay, and I can tell you that the maximum that each country can reduce emissions is 10, and there are 100 countries, so this is essentially out of 1,000. Yeah? And in each cell, there are the 3 solutions to the game: non-cooperation, the treaty, and full cooperation. Okay? And so let's just look at what's going on down here in the bottom left, where we saw we had all 100 countries participating in the treaty. So and they all reduce emissions to the max, giving us the full 1,000 units of abatement. But the thing is, the benefits and costs of action are such that they would have done almost as much of that under non-cooperation as they do under the treaty. So the treaty essentially adds very little, because with this structure of benefits and costs, there's almost no difference between the non-cooperative solution and the full cooperative solution. So the treaty is broad. It has a lot of countries in it, it has all the countries in it. But it's not adding anything. The benefits of action are so large relative to the costs that it was individually rational for these countries to almost abate emissions completely anyway. Conversely, if we look at other parts of the table, right, so let's just pick the middle cell. The gap between non-cooperation and full cooperation is large here, right? It's the difference between 500 and 990, yeah? So in principle, the treaty could add a lot of value here, right? We could go from, we could double, virtually double the amount of emissions abatement. But in fact, if you go back one slide as well, we've only got 3 countries in the treaty here. And so although they all do a bit more than they would non-cooperatively, it barely makes a difference. It barely makes a difference. And that's pretty much the situation in all of these other cells of the matrix here, where there's a big difference between non-cooperation and full cooperation. Right? The treaty sizes are small, and so although the countries inside the treaty are playing the full cooperative strategy, it's not making much difference. So this basically lands us back in the place that we were in the 2-player binary choice game, where we say, given the structure of this problem, if we give countries the opportunity to cooperate with each other by signing a treaty, we're going to either get very few countries in the treaty, or we're going to get almost all countries in the treaty, but it's going to be very shallow. Right? It's essentially just going to be codifying what they were going to do anyway. And so that's because this problem has the prisoner's dilemma still at its core, right? Still a very strong incentive to free ride. That's why the treaty sizes across a lot of the combinations here. That's why the treaty sizes are so small. Because if the benefits are large, there is a large incentive to free ride on other countries providing them. Unless the costs are tiny, in which case you might as well pay, which is what gets you down here. Now, this may have been a little hard for you, or you may also, even if it wasn't a little hard for you, you may be wondering whether this is all just a sort of theoretical curiosity. But when we actually start thinking about real-world emissions pathways, so thinking back to week 5, it starts to open our minds to some stuff that we might not have thought about. So this is not the UNEP emissions gap report or anything that I actually taught you in week 5, but it is a paper by Bill Nordhaus and Silly Yang where they actually implemented the cooperative and non-cooperative solutions in a regional version of Nordhaus's DICE model, right? So they're trying to make this, to your point, Bill. So here we're starting to talk about the results of a study where we actually have realistic world regions and within the context of an IAM, realistic costs and benefits. Okay, and we are interested in comparing 3 scenarios here: the sort of business as usual or baseline kind of laissez-faire outcome, the non-cooperative equilibrium, where countries reduce emissions only up to the point where their private benefits are equal to their private costs at the margin, and the cooperative equilibrium, where countries solve the full cooperative solution. What I really wanted to draw your attention to is this. So this is an old paper, right? So this is from 20 years ago. But their prediction was that if countries solved the non-cooperative problem, they would reduce emissions by about 10% below the baseline level. Okay? These numbers, this is in gigatons of carbon. In terms of gigatons of CO2, this is about 59 gigatons, this is about 53 gigatons. Those numbers are remarkably close to what we've actually got. And moreover, this difference is remarkably close to what organisations like Climate Action Tracker and UNEP predict would be the outcome of the Paris NDCs. So that makes us ask the following question, which would be a great question to ask you as we take a break. Have the Paris NDCs actually brought anything additional to the table here? Or are the emissions reductions that countries are implementing in pursuit of the Paris Agreement simply codifying what they would have done anyway? Do they simply constitute the solution to the non-cooperative climate problem? That's the thing we want to talk about. Okay, let's take 10 minutes break until 10 past 3.
More interesting question is when we're going to pay everything. So now finally I understood that. So for March,
I have iPad. I'm rocking with my iPad. Exactly. But have you seen all the people that use their iPads too much and it causes blood vessel issues in your back if you use them too much?
right? Interesting consultation.
You need to be careful.
Whole world. Couldn't say it. Yes, the phone. So we should that. Yeah. Honestly, no.
I'm trying to be very careful.
And you know, so the
Yeah, okay, so that's
it's like the general manager of the model. It's not in 2016 now. I was wondering if you could in the call, the LSE.
So much fun. I think I was telling you this one too.
I didn't know the application. I was trying to ask people. The paper is we have to take off for that.
That's a different problem.
Sharing a currency, and they have to not take too much time, not happening. I mean, whatever.
well, right. But also,
I had to come back, it's been too long. Huh? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, look at this, man.
Not the 9 to 5, but she works like single days, so then she's like, you get okay, well, I guess I'll see you again. No, it was like my older sister. Well, she's also my older. And then my other sister's like, oh yeah, I didn't tell you. It's all good. She's like, sorry, it's supposed to be.
Not even satisfied.
And now I'm like all the
Yeah, man, that's good. That's good. With the charm, I think you need to.
But also,
my topic now, but
Are you going to be bringing up any
schedule something else. Like,
in terms of distraction of all the politics? Yeah, that's the first thing.
Wait, so like, did everybody do like all these things for video? So, but I was actually
I'm gonna do this. First, I was like, break, and second, I was studying for it.
but I think I'm
In September, try to start something happening.
I don't want to reach the side.
You put on the call. Hey, no, you used to like really demand people. Different models. I play both.
I know
Okay, so let's get started again. So, spent the first hour thinking about game theory, talking about the prisoner's dilemma. It emphasizes the incentive to free ride, which comes from climate change being a global externality, leads us to a pessimistic conclusion that countries won't cooperate to solve the climate problem. Even if it's possible for them to sign a treaty, relatively few will join a treaty when it really matters. Okay? Now, what we want to do at this stage of the afternoon is we want to try to broaden the story a little bit, right? So step out of this very stylized game theory setup and think about what further considerations might we want to bring in here. So let's brainstorm that for 5 to 10 minutes. So I can get us started here with one which is still quite related to the game we've looked at. So one thing we could do to make this story richer is we could move from a one-shot game to a repeated game, okay? And then, as we discussed earlier, in a repeated game, let's have a chance to observe the behaviours of other players over time. Okay. I can tell you, some of you will know this, others I don't have time to explain what particularly, but if a game is repeated a finite number of times, it doesn't change anything because you just work backwards from the last round of the game. Okay? But if the game is repeated an infinite number of times, or equivalently, if you don't know when the game ends, that might be a fair description of the climate negotiations, then it can be that different strategies are better, like tit for tat, kind of conditional cooperation strategies, where you basically reward good behavior by behaving well yourself and punish bad behavior by behaving badly yourself. Okay? So that's one additional consideration, but it's still very much keeping us within the game theory framework. What else do we think is relevant when we talk about climate cooperation? Yeah.
Sorry, I have a good question. How would the game play out if the game ends based on the action of the players?
Is that not like a one-shot game?
No, not necessarily. Like, if the players make certain decisions, the game continues. If they take a certain other decision, the game ends. So it's like the game could be infinite based on which I mean, at least I would see it as more related to climate change.
I think that would tend towards either a finite game or an infinitely repeated game, depending on. I mean, if one set of actions could cause it to be infinitely repeated, then it will just be an infinitely repeated game. But I haven't thought about it too hard.
You would have sort of other actions that they can take, so adjacent actions like tariffs or so on.
Exactly, so that's good. So we want to, and this is often sometimes described as issue linkage, right? So, for example, trade tariffs as punishments. We could link it with other issues as well. So that's really good. So that's one thing we want to bring into the story here at some point. Yeah.
Different MAT curves or different cost?
Yeah, so look, country asymmetries,
Yep.
right? Yeah, exactly. So we'll talk about that. Of which, we spent a good part of the course talking about the fact that these are important, so we want to bring them back in. Yeah.
Bargaining power.
Yeah. So bargaining power and more generally, power is going to be a topic we want to cover. Yes?
Could you also have like new entrants or exits from the coalition or corporation?
I'm trying to think about whether that really takes us outside the framework that we've already been working in. In a game that is repeated an infinite number of times or an uncertain number of times, you can get changes to the coalition size or changes to behaviour over time. That is true. And I think that probably falls into this category. Yes.
Self-diplomacy when you're kind of friendly.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's really good, by the way, that we're stepping well outside the game with some of these considerations, because we don't want to be stuck in a formal game for the whole of the afternoon, do we? Yeah.
Imperfect information on payoffs.
Yeah. One of the ways that I hope we will talk about that is in terms of how climate targets are formulated and the problem of transparency, monitoring and verification. But one could obviously also take that in a very technical direction and think about a game with imperfect information, yes.
Irrationality or inefficiency?
Yeah, or so let's say irrationality and more sort of more complex state behaviour, let's say. We might not describe it as irrational per se. States may care about their reputations, for example, rather than just being quite ruthlessly focused on their narrow payoffs. We could easily restate the game in such a way that states payoffs include their reputation. Yes?
Knowledge sharing or trading of technology.
Yes. So knowledge sharing, technology transfer, I think you were thinking about, weren't you? Which I think links with this issue linkage in a way, because we might, you could imagine a form of cooperation where countries offer to export their knowledge in return for the importing country taking on emissions targets, right? So you take on an emissions target, we'll give you intellectual property, something like that. I can think about that.
Historical emissions and current levels of emissions.
Yeah.
And levels of development as well.
I mean, it's a specific. So we talked generally about country asymmetries. So this is a sort of particular examples of it. Would include historical emissions, and what was the other thing you said?
Levels of development.
Levels of development. Thank you.
You could like make the agents like level more granular. So for example, add new agents like firms or like interest groups, for example. So just go away from the pure country level.
Yeah. So and we're going to introduce this issue in a specific way called multi-level governance. Right? But so I'm just going to write that down. But your point is a little more general than that. But what you want to do is unpack the nation state in some sense and think about the nation state not as a unitary actor.
Yeah.
Because that's what all this does, right? It treats the nation state as an individual. So sort of homogeneous or amorphous. And we could unpack that and think about lobby groups, voters, firms, that kind of thing. Yes. Now, do you have that?
You said what I was going to say.
Connect to the soft diplomacy, like non-climate related priorities as well.
Yeah. Can we have that under issue linkage or?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Okay, but times 2. Times 2. You both had your hands up before, so I'll go back to that.
I also don't know if that's too close to issue linkages, but like conflicting goals. For example, the energy dilemma that they want to have it cheap, safe, and
yeah, the sort of energy trilemma, as they call it. Yeah. So, what we should do here? Let's issue linkage / other goals. Yeah, and then I think the point here is that this could either be harnessed to make an agreement easier, or it could make it harder. It's a question.
It was similar with domestic politics, like.
Yeah. So that's e.g. domestic politics. There's a paper called Domestic Politics and the Formation of International Environmental Agreements by me. Turns out it matters a bit. And in non-intuitive ways sometimes. I'm not going to say any more than that because it was a hard paper to write, so I'm sure it's a hard paper to read. Anything else? You had some thoughts you shared with me in the break about things that you thought I should be talking about.
Considering neo-realism as a theoretical concept to.
So you can tell me a bit more about that as an ignorant economist?
It's the idea that within global politics, countries care about who's becoming the next political hegemon.
Yes, okay, yeah.
And so that overrides other considerations, including climate.
Yeah. So neo-realism, hegemony, these kind of ideas from international relations, basically.
Yes.
Sort of thinking about, I suppose, like power plays between countries and that kind of stuff. Yeah, we'll bring in some flavour of those ideas. I can't claim that I'm going to be doing that full service, right? But I hope to at least bring some of those ideas in. Okay, yeah, one more.
With climate effects would be one side of the story.
Sorry?
Climate effects, like US is disregarding like NOR climate data, and then Europe is talking about more like IPCC type data.
So like
data realism.
You're thinking about how actors like governments are behaving towards climate science. Yeah, I mean, which is important. I'm going to think of that as a subset of the issues raised by domestic politics. Okay, where you know, in this case, you've got sort of the capture of the nation state by a particular set of interests. And one of the tools that they're using is the destruction of scientific research. Right? So I'm going to think of that as being a subset of those issues.
This would be country asymmetries too, but it would be like how different countries are affected by climate change differently.
Yeah. So I definitely, so we could think about country asymmetries in terms of benefits, in terms of costs, in terms of things like historical emissions, which feeds into costs but is important in other ways, not just in terms of costs and benefits. But anyway, this brainstorm, I think, has served its purpose well which is really just to open our minds to other elements of the story. And so what I want to do now is bring in a few of those. So there was only one more slide in this deck, and it was the summary slide, which of course you can read at your leisure. So let's pull up the final mini lecture, of the entire course. It better be good. Okay, so we're going to bring in a few additional perspectives here. And this is going to get us a little bit closer to what we're going to be talking about after the next break, which is, if we had to design an architecture for agreement, to use that terminology, for climate change, what would it look like? The three things that I want to focus on, and that's not to say that they're the only things that are important, are firstly, we're going to embrace this idea of asymmetries between countries. We're going to do it in terms of benefits and costs, and then we're going to think about power, which is going to take us a little bit more in the international relations direction. We're then going to talk about something that we actually hadn't talked about much in that brainstorming session just now, which is institutions. So we pretty much followed the game theory mold in the past 10 minutes by just ignoring institutions and just thinking about countries, or at most subnational actors somehow coming together and cooperating, but we didn't talk about how and under what auspices. Okay, so institutions. And lastly, we'll talk about multilateral and polycentric governance. Okay, so differences between countries. So we've talked about how standard game theory assumes symmetrical countries, which has this stunningly counterintuitive result that they don't all do the same thing in the treaty game, right? Which I get is counterintuitive, but that's what happens. But countries are clearly not identical, and here we can bring in lots of different bits of the course. So we talked in week 5 at length about who's responsible for the temperature that we now have, and who is going to be responsible for the temperatures that we experience over the coming decades. Okay, and that's a strongly asymmetric, right? Historically, emissions have mainly been produced by the now industrialized countries. Increasingly, a large share is accounted for by certain emerging market developing countries like China and India. Okay, so we've got differences in responsibility for the problem. Sounds like a storm is coming. Now, if you go back to week 3, right, so bringing ideas back from week 3, we talked a lot about differential vulnerability to climate change, right? We talked a lot about how climate change doesn't hit countries equally, about how, in general, it's worse for countries that are already hot, and countries that are already hot happen to be countries that are poorer than average. So that is another issue we want to bring back. So generally, how does this come into our thinking? Well, the first thing that happens when countries are asymmetrical is that you will get differences between countries in terms of what their privately optimal strategy will be, right? So if you remember before the break talking about where MBI intersects with MCI, yeah, the sort of each country's solution to the non-cooperative problem. And in the game we talked about before the break, all the countries were symmetrical, so they would all do the same thing. Well, when countries are asymmetric, they will do different things, right? But we might generally say that if we look at how the costs and benefits of climate action are distributed around the world, then the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change are mostly not the big emitters, right? We're talking about the small island developing states, the least developed countries, whose emissions are negligible. Okay? The big emitters in the world are, I'm not saying that they're invulnerable to climate change, but they're not among the most vulnerable. And that just makes actually the problem worse. because it means the countries that you think about it counterfactually. Imagine the big emitters, the US, China, the EU, Russia. Imagine that they were the most vulnerable countries to climate change. Well, then they would do a lot privately, non-cooperatively, to reduce emissions. Okay? But unfortunately, we've got the opposite distribution. The big emitters are, generally speaking, not the most vulnerable. So what it's really telling us is that when we bring that factor in, the non-cooperative solution is not going to be very ambitious, or at least it's less ambitious than it might have been if the incentives were better aligned. That's one of the 2 points I want to make here. The second point is that with differences between countries, also including their contribution to the problem historically, you add a new dimension to the negotiations. It's not just a cooperation, it's not necessarily just a question of whether it's rational to cooperate or not. You can also get arguments about what's fair. That's the additional thing that brings into it. And if you look at the international negotiations, you do observe long-standing arguments about what's fair and just, right, for different kinds of countries. And it could be that that is just code for what is rational, right? It could be that countries are just using fairness arguments in a purely self-serving way. Or it could be that there is substantively an argument going on about what's fair. But anyway, that is the second way, to my mind, in which having country asymmetries enriches our story. So just to reiterate, the first thing that country asymmetries do is they change the character of the non-cooperative solution, but not in a helpful way. The second thing that country asymmetries do is that they add a new dimension on which countries can disagree with each other. Not just in terms of whether they should cooperate or not, but in terms of what would be a fair share of the burdens. So that's the first. Previous slides still very much thinking about this in terms of the game. Okay, we did start to broaden that out and think a little bit about fairness, but we can broaden this a little bit further and think about power and start to reach a bit further into some international relations theories. So some of these theories would basically say that if we want to understand the climate negotiations, we only need to understand what are in the interests of the most powerful states. Yeah. And some of the outcomes of the climate negotiations historically seem to be consistent with that idea. So you'll remember from the video that basically the outcome of the Copenhagen conference was very much forced by four countries, yeah. The basic countries: Brazil, South Africa, India, China. Was Russia in there? And those are influential countries. In the run-up to the Paris Agreement, there was the US and China came to a bilateral agreement about what was going to be in their NDCs. Right? So that seems to be a story consistent with power being important, because here were the two great world powers basically getting together even before the Paris Agreement and agreeing what they were going to say in Paris, thereby setting the parameters. And yeah, in general, you can see in the negotiations the importance of the largest emitters and their interests coming through. But on the other hand, you can also see outcomes in the international negotiations which don't look like the simple outcome of powerful states' interests. So at times, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist bloc, the US was the global power, the global hegemon, right? And was often, but not always, but often in that period, it was opposed to international environmental treaty making, and yet treaties did get signed. The 1.5 degrees goal in the Paris Agreement was a surprising inclusion. I mean, we take it for granted now that that's a valid climate goal, but it was very surprising to many of us that it found its way into the Paris Treaty text. And it was largely a product of small island developing states kind of effectively lobbying and building coalitions within the negotiations with other groups of countries interested in pushing climate action like the European Union. And this challenges the idea of power because the small island developing states are not powerful. Yeah, so we could say more generally that negotiations often involve coalitions of states, norms, and moral arguments, and not just raw power. Next thing I want to talk about is institutions. Okay, so we've already, the first point basically already made, which is that game theory has really nothing to say about institutions. The only institutions in the prisoner's dilemma game are, as applied to countries, are the countries. But you know, when I was telling the story of international climate cooperation, institutions had quite a large role, right? So just think about the UNFCCC itself. That is we could think about that as an institution. And I explained at the beginning of mini lecture 10.1 that the reason we have a UN framework convention on climate change is because we were following a tried and tested model. The framework convention, something that had been tried before in other contexts, like the whole of the ozone layer, acid rain. So that is a story about an institution because it's a forum, it's a way of countries cooperating that we had used before, right? And that we defaulted to because it seemed to have worked in the past. So this opens our minds to the ideas that the institutions could be important. They're costly to construct. Once you've got institutions, it's quite difficult to just erase them, having new institutions. So you get a form of path dependency. And institutions can become self-interested as well. So I'm sure that all of us have a story to share about when we've been dealing with some part of the bureaucracy and we felt like we were in a Kafka novel where we were dealing with a faceless organization that seemed to just be interested in its own, furthering its own aims, right? Well, that would be sort of, you can explain that kind of story, right? Like there are theories of that. So, the idea of a regime complex for climate change, which comes from Robert Peary and David Victor, that's very much in this institutional tradition. It invites us to, firstly, just to think about how many institutions exist that actually are involved in climate cooperation. So far in this week, we've mainly just talked about the UNFCCC and the various elements of that and the COPs. But we've got all these other institutions which have at various times been involved in trying to advance climate cooperation, right? Including IPCC, various other UN agencies, right? Like UNEP, and so on. Various other clubs of countries like the G8 and the G20, right? They've been active in trying to further climate cooperation. That's outside of the UN process, right? Some of the gases regulated under the Montreal Protocol on the ozone layer also contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, to climate warming, right? The greenhouse gases. So to some extent, cooperation under the Montreal Protocol has been relevant here. We've got the multilateral development banks, right? The World Bank, other regional banks like the Asian Development Bank, right? They're very active on climate change. And so on and so forth, right? With the circle generally drawn around the more central institutions involved in making rules. Right? So really, what they're, the first thing we do when we look at a chart like this is we just realize, we just open our minds to the idea that lots of different institutions are involved in trying to advance climate action. It's not just countries, and actually it's not just the UN Framework Convention and the climate summits. It's a lot of other multilateral and national level institutions. And once we've recognised that, we can then have a really interesting conversation about what are the best institutions to be advancing climate action, and are they different ones to the ones that we have been relying on up to this point, principally the UN Framework Convention and the climate summits, okay? So in that tradition, David Victor, one of the two authors of the chart in the previous slide, wrote a paper where he was he was basically showing how if you look across lots of different kinds of international agreements, both environmental agreements and other kinds of agreements, so the Tokyo Round Codes, that's basically the trade rules, Codex is food standards, okay? He basically just points out that these agreements can look quite different to the UN Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement on at least two dimensions. Firstly, in terms of whether the commitments that countries make are legally binding or not. And secondly, in terms of whether the negotiations are run by senior politicians or by diplomats, lawyers, and bureaucrats. So he was writing a pre-Paris agreement, so he was primarily thinking about the Kyoto Protocol, which is one of the climate treaties that we're interested in this week. And he was pointing out that it tried to introduce legally binding commitments, and it was largely negotiated by diplomats, lawyers, and bureaucrats, and he was drawing a contrast between that and some other agreements which were quite different. And he was saying, well, would we be better off if we just negotiated this more in a different style? We tried to get away from making legally binding commitments, for example, and if we tried to make this more about senior politicians, presidents, prime ministers, and getting them to make vaguer commitments. The last thing I want to talk about is multi-level and polycentric governance, and this gives me an opportunity to say a few things about the Ostrom paper, which is in your readings for this week, quite possibly in your readings for some other courses. When we talk about cooperation to protect the environment, we have to talk about Ostrom. Her perspective is one of the most important perspectives here. Before we get into Ostrom's contribution to thought in this area, we just start with this observation she makes about climate change, which is that many activities can be undertaken by multiple units at diverse scales that cumulatively make a difference. I argue that instead of focusing only on global efforts, it's better to encourage polycentric efforts to reduce the risks of climate change. Polycentric approaches facilitate achieving benefits at multiple scales as well as experimentation and learning. What she's essentially trying to do here, which are points that have already come up, is she's basically saying that if we are fixated with trying to do this through negotiations between nation states, we will progress more slowly than we would if we allow action beyond the nation state, right, by non-state actors. That's the essence of our argument. It's an argument, it's not a fact. But writing in 2010, after the fairly disastrous Copenhagen summit, she was essentially saying that, well, what I, as in Ostrom, take from that failure is that we need to get away from nation states negotiating with each other. We need to break this problem down into, for example, coalitions of cities working together or grassroots organizations, and just generally go both below the nation state level, i.e. multi-level, and think about different kinds of actor, i.e. polycentric. And that then allows, why is she saying that? Well, there she's really building on what she has taken away from her life's work, looking at cooperation to provide mainly sort of local level environmental goods. And what she took out of all of those sort of cases that she documented at the local level is that it is possible for groups of actors to cooperate to provide environmental goods when a narrow game theory perspective would be pessimistic because it would predict a tragedy of the commons. And one, you know, for her, one of the key mechanisms here was trust and reciprocity, right? So she emphasized the idea that if the different players in the game could come to trust each other and could reciprocate by punishing bad behavior or rewarding good behavior, you could actually get cooperation. And she was taking those ideas and she was trying to think about how you apply those to climate change. And she was saying that, well, if we get beyond the nation state, we might get into productive bottom-up cooperation between organizations like grassroots organizations, investors, cities, whatever.
I was thinking about like the trigger strategies in game theory and how like this trust and reciprocity are central and can be sustained, but what happens when someone defects? Like right now, like Trump is defecting for everything, and it's like getting to a worse equilibrium that like the kind of cooperative one that we had before.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that in the final hour, that I mean, part of the point of the final hour is to actually think about this proposition of hers alongside two other possible architectures, and we can all think together about, you know, what seems most promising.
I was thinking with this system, by like dividing the groups from like a top down, bottom up, aren't you increasing the number of players in this world game, like, and therefore making cooperation even harder? Like back in the ground.
You are definitely increasing the number of players, but some of the ideas here include that when you do this, you also can change the payoffs by, for example, letting subsets of actors cooperate on things that they would, you know, that are small parts of the problem, right? So we're not just increasing the number of players here. The idea is that when we're, the hope is that when we go to smaller scales or when we break the problem up horizontally, well, it could be breaking up horizontally as well as vertically, that we're actually making the system more flexible and can allow countries to cooperate on things that, for example, clean technology transfer, you know, just not required to come to agreements on emissions. Let's just try to come to an agreement on clean technology transfer, for example. So we're breaking the problem up in many more ways than just adding players. Potentially creating lots of sub-games which might have cooperative solutions.
Would they have the same issue that the world one would have with a much smaller scale?
Well, that's something for us to think about, right? This is not the point in the afternoon for me to be saying that this is good or bad. This is what we want to do. Okay, I think this is a good time to take another break. Yeah, so let's take a 10-minute break and start again at 4 o'clock.
Oh my god, holy shit. I'm gonna eat my crackers. Are you going to obviously we got well solved. But at the same time, do you know what they're gonna do? They might talk to back in
Also kind of.
They split them so like all the like based on like or is it random? So you have some like random. So it's like realized that why we wait till this week.
But the crazy part is that
No,
our last
yeah, I got kind of busy on the
yeah,
Except for one quick read. Sunglasses on in the clinic.
Actually, that'd be a good chance
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Show your age. I remember seeing this movie.
yeah, and he was
People
like,
didn't even look at my dissertation.
Yeah. I actually like looked at her away from friends and I forgot like and like daydream that, you know,
now we're waiting for the house.
Like who's next?
next week.
Yeah, like yesterday he was one of the candidates.
Yeah, we kind of went all around.
So we like just on
It's such a like word. I mean like it's funny. Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Like it's like a
Yo, over there, I don't
Yeah, my part is one of like the Italian restaurant I went to and I tried some like vegetables. I was
a big difference.
laksa and wait.
Good for you.
I mean like
I know, that's like was fully formed back then. Yeah. Not what age I actually have a thing about doing so like men actually do like mental it's like they're it's like kid and 22 and then it's like 63 to 62 and then yeah, so I'm like I don't even know if that was in the headline. I think it was just like whoa, like better, yeah, like everything is
Either way, yeah.
So the funny thing
Well, sometimes. How much? Wait, how much did you listen to? Like people are really. I went to the house last whenever that would happen, I would start. No, I would just start admitting whenever I feel like art. See, like backfired on me. Like did, and I was like, you know what? It was like a popcorn machine. Everyone loved it. I just did not expect
Hold on.
Oh my god, it's anarchy.
I'm selling the
I actually totally forgot about it. I thought there was like no racism.
Yeah, I did too.
I sit on like a plastic.
My girlfriend gets it.
Why is more like no, because I was like a TV. Give it to like and then take it back. Yeah.
One idea we just like put it out. I would run the
Oh my god, that was I wouldn't tell it. Do you know?
just like use it.
I know, exactly. Finders
Squatting lights on my TV.
Oh yeah. Fun with that. Wait, sorry. It's just an art complex.
No.
Oh, really? Oh, where did you get it? Did you really? Well, Facebook. Stuff. Like she's like furnishing her flat. Like a worldwide well, I don't like
2 minutes.
I would definitely do it. Obviously, like less choice. Get really good stuff. For me, like,
Well, your stuff just
And what I'm going to do is I feel like I'm professionally better matches. And if they call me a liar.
But you copied me, so?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
No, but I.
Last day of life. I don't know.
Yeah, when you're looking at the
I was in like 4 different places. I know. You see that already on the baseball and now back to Ryan. I think I think that's why they did it at once. I'm like,
Okay, let's get settled in again.
a big chunk of us being able to like ask questions and like stuff like that. Yeah, so many just messages saying like this is scheduled now, like
Okay.
the Friday, the last Friday.
Are you just gonna work on
I've already like
Alright, so we're going to do the assignment.
Keep going. You can't win a dad. You can't like beat a dad. You don't have something like that.
I have an issue with the tech at the moment, but you have it in front of you. Alright, so just to get us warmed up, first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a comparison between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. We're just going to try and think about not which one was better, but what were the key design features of these two agreements. So just spend 5 minutes with your neighbours just going over what you've learned about these two agreements, what were their key features, and how are they different from each other. Okay, that's the thing we're going to do first. So 5 minutes first discussing the differences between Kyoto and Paris.
What's the tablet?
this is so ice. I love it. There's a great like Kyoto and all of that fucking stuff. Kyoto was the first ever like how are they different now?
Legally binding, right?
I think our parents were part of history that actually why it didn't happen.
one is like the countries how much do you want to use customers? No, but I think it's also like just hard something like that, right?
Yeah, so there was
wasn't as much as
there weren't targets for everybody.
and also, all of the skills basically will know it's in the here, but all the time. If you're in a different sphere, you just cross completely like no, seriously, this is what I mean. Like the people, UK a little bit, yeah.
Fair enough. Go to the pub. But I think one of the like final
that would
I think
right?
be like guys who have to
No, that was Copenhagen. There was Copenhagen actually. So there's like
NDCs are applicable countries, but they are not. I just want like one of them was not the only one. So we can say. Instead of in the framework convention, they talked about stabilizing levels, and then in Paris they talked about it text well below Kyoto, and they
yeah, but also I think
you don't start them, but you just always happen to have the bullshit.
very, I think it's very, in the private sector, it's the same. You're very careful how you position your application, like social rising, so you don't know where these institutions stand, you don't know where the business is. You have informed the business, it could be
Is there a way that I can like
Yes, you could also record the table in your application.
I already
no, I think
You have no problem employment for you anyway.
I will be I'll be surprised. I know. Right? Can't predict that with the game theory.
like I don't
Want to apply.
It looks so good.
Try to summarize the key features of Kyoto versus Paris and then try to characterize them. So let's start with the Kyoto Protocol. So what are the key design features of the Kyoto Protocol? Let's hear some of the things you've been talking about. Yes?
Is that the first quantitative emission targets?
Yeah, so we've got quantitative emissions targets. Important feature.
I think they were legally binding for the developed countries.
Yes. So in fact, it was just the developed countries that had them. They were legally binding. We can have a discussion at some point about what that means. It is subtle. One of the things it does mean, though, that there, in principle there was an enforcement mechanism in the Kyoto Protocol, right? Which is that if you didn't meet your target, you would be penalised by taking on an even tougher target in the next period.
There was a clear distinction between developing countries and countries in transition for their emissions targets, and developing countries didn't have emission targets.
Yeah, exactly. So there was this, mainly there was this Annex 1 versus non-Annex 1 sort of firewall, if you want to call it that. We can call it that. So the developing countries outside of Annex 1 didn't have to have, it looks like an F, doesn't it? So, didn't need to have quantitative emissions targets, that's right, yeah.
There was flexibility about how you could abate your emissions.
Yeah, so there were a range of so-called flexible mechanisms. Can you list some of them?
Like taxes or permits. Decide what.
Yeah, mainly not taxes, but emissions trading between countries. There was something called the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, which was like a crediting mechanism for non-Annex 1 countries to sell emissions credits to Annex 1 countries at no kind of loss to the non-Annex 1 countries. So it was designed to be just if they wanted to, voluntary. There were some other, like the fact that it was a basket of gases, and also a multi-year compliance period. These were all designed to manage costs. And I think for our purposes, the most interesting ones were the market-based instruments. Yeah. I think that's all we need to cover, really. But that doesn't mean there aren't other good points to make. Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting, the minimum participation rule. That's why.
Ah, yes. Okay. Yes. Yes. So there was this.
Interaction so late.
Yeah. It's true. So it's 55% of emission. 55% of emissions, something like that. I can't remember exactly. I used to remember that counting.
Yeah, there was Annex 2 for within Annex 1 for each Annex 1 countries to help developing countries.
It was. That was more pertinent to finance. Okay, but I think these are the key things we want. I particularly wanted to emphasise the quantitative targets, the fact that they were legally binding, the Annex 1, non-Annex 1 firewall, and the flexible mechanisms. The other points made are good points as well, but these are the things that are going to interest us most. Okay, let's turn to the Paris Agreement. So, what are the key features of the Paris Agreement?
You have in this case the NDC, which is first voluntary. Well, the submission is actually mandatory, and NDC has a lot of diversity in regards of how emissions are measured.
Yes, exactly. So the NDCs, the act of submitting an NDC and updating it is legally binding, but the content of the NDC is non-binding. Okay? So the NDCs can in some sense be thought of as non-binding pledges. Within a legally binding framework. And that is well discussed in Robert Faulkner's paper, which is in the reading list. So we have these NDCs. Yeah.
It included the ratchet mechanism, I believe
Yeah.
it was called, where it has to be more ambitious every 5 years.
Yeah, so it has this mechanism in it to try to increase ambition over time. Each NDC needs to be more ambitious than the last. That's the ratchet mechanism.
It had a specific temperature target. It wasn't the first one, but it had a temperature target. Or two to be precise.
Yeah. Different from Kyoto.
Which maybe just worth highlighting that I think it's the first time that 1.5 was mentioned.
Yeah, it was the first time it got into the UN process formally in treaty text.
Tied to that, it had the emission path aligned to the temperature targets.
Yeah, so there was some
The net zero
pathway.
Yeah.
Parameters or sort of constraint, let's call it constraints on the emissions path, or some attempt to elaborate what an emissions path would look like, which would give the temperature goals. I mean, once you start framing the objective in terms of temperatures, you then need to ideally say something more about what that means for emissions. So they were trying to fill that gap between country level NDCs, which were often like, we'll cut by X% by 2030 with the temperature goal. Okay, a bunch of hands going up the galaxy.
I guess kind of included in NDCs, but you're re-including developing countries.
Yes. So so the firewall disappeared. Okay. And we started to see developing countries. We have developing countries within NDCs, and because many NDCs contain emissions targets, most do, that means that developing countries have targets. They might be non-binding pledges, but at least that's different from Kyoto.
The Paris Agreement includes the global goal adaptation, implementation.
Yeah, so.
And that it also considers there being a transparency report. So on your own business, you have to give an update of everything that you have been doing.
Yeah, so the first point was adaptation, was it?
Global goal adaptation.
Yeah, global goal adaptation. Yeah. Okay, so that's adaptation finance, essentially. Okay. And the second point is
implementation.
Yeah, transparency. Kind of thing.
It's technology, capacity, and financial.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's good. So there's a chart I wanted to show you. I switched over to the desktop because Todd knows what was going on with Microsoft. I think this captures it pretty neatly. You might have already seen it if you've browsed the slides, but one way it's been characterized is that, and I think we obviously talked about this in the videos as well, so we've gone on a journey from the Kyoto Protocol, which we could understand as a top-down treaty, attempting to work down from a global emissions goal, divide that up into a set of country-level emissions targets, which are legally binding and have a timetable associated with them, that rely on a relatively few market-based instruments to deliver them. And move, of course, you know, there are some good things and some bad things about that. proved difficult to secure broad and deep participation in that style of treaty, which stimulated this journey towards the Paris Agreement, which is not completely bottom-up, but is more bottom-up than the Kyoto Protocol, and is also has more measures in it than just sort of international emissions targets and market-based instruments. It's a much more multifaceted type of agreement. So really the punchline here is to get you to think about this journey that the UN climate process has gone through, driving us towards Paris, where we're characterized by much more by non-binding pledges, albeit on a kind of legally binding timetable. Much more freedom for countries to express their commitments in different ways. Much more ways in which countries are cooperating, and a whole, outside of the Paris, a whole sort of a whole set of pledges and agreements outside of the formal negotiating process, right? Like the global methane pledge, for example. And we want to ask the question, was that the right way to go? What were the pros and cons of going from Kyoto to Paris? And supposing Kyoto wasn't working, which is still a genuinely an interesting question, because that was also 1997. Things were very different, right? Supposing we wanted to go away from Kyoto, should we have gone in a different direction? That's what I want you all to think about, and that was the point of the readings that I asked you to take a look at. So there are obviously many different architectures that we could talk about, but to keep things tractable, we're going to focus on three types here. The first is a Kyoto-style top-down treaty involving targets, timetables, and legally binding. Okay, so I can put that up here. Kyoto-style. The second one is, we'll go for the sort of most contrasting one, perhaps, the kind of, what we'll call it, the kind of Ostrom style bottom-up cooperation. Shouldn't really even call it a treaty. Okay. So that's almost going to the opposite end of the spectrum. And the third one, which is, I'll put it over here so we've got a bit of space, but it's also kind of a bit in between, is this kind of hybrid regime where we're often still working at the level of nation states, and we're trying to form treaties, but we're no longer trying to form a universal treaty. Right? We're now thinking about splitting the world into clubs of countries or industrial sectors or similar interest groups, and seeing whether it would be better to allow a larger number of small treaties and agreements to form. And what we're trying to reflect on really is which of these three architectures is most likely to deliver progress, to actually deliver emission reduction. So stepping out of the Paris paradigm, not necessarily taking Paris for granted, just taking a step back and thinking about, well, is it the right way to do things? Should we go back to Kyoto? Should we abandon the UN process altogether? Sometimes it just looks like a massive, great big waste of time. Should we just scrap it, save some air miles and some emissions, and just try to do this thing just from the bottom up, like anarchy in a way? I mean that pejoratively, although it may sound like it. Or is there some other way forward? So I want you to 10 minutes to reflect on that with your neighbours, and then we'll come back together and we'll try to have a discussion about the strengths and weaknesses of these different architectures, okay? So 10 minutes on that, please.
I like kind of skip
Yeah, like having well, it depends on like that could be top down, but like
some suggestion that like it was Nicole was talking about doing like short-term
like other options you had common government the assumption that cooperation requires external enforcement. Allow simultaneous I agree. I think
yeah, exactly. That's what I was I literally clearly on you. I want something to like chew on fast.
I mean, it could be yeah, but that's like what my mind goes to. Very
similarly, like
I do think that I like the
yeah, also you know like whereas like we're top down approach. Just like sense it does something. So I think it's like successful. So like caveats and then like I know it's
and common habitat. Like, but like in that way,
don't do it.
that's not going up. Like the emissions gap.
Drop off
Like you're like, oh, you still have not all of these things. No, that's and you don't have it that way. Exactly. So it's like, is that weakness or is that like a usable part of like? So I'm like, is it okay? Is it a failure in a sense that like don't do it? What is that? Like, you want to establish no, that's like, yeah, I feel like that failure in that. But I think that's probably a lot of right? Like, it's not right now. And that's why I don't know, like, a lot about this. That's like how it looks like, right? Like, well, yeah, because that's what you're like, no, it's not, it's like that's a full, like, if you're in it, you're in it. But aligning in the sense that you're not walking, but like, it's not, it's kind of like, I mean, that, yeah, but like, that's the huge part, yeah. Yeah. Like fire.
Also like the issue issue for
Whereas like no other like
you don't have like emissions, you don't transfer.
No, I think that yeah, that's like yeah, that like that's not
it is, but it all yeah. Like in terms of
even aside from that,
don't look at the size of it. I don't know why.
It's community. If you say, I'm gonna yeah, somebody
Scheduled our makeup class for the night. Also with this group.
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
But I don't
exactly, or you have like a not skills and stuff. Maybe like world, and it's like
Yeah, but that's because we was what expanded.
It's like someone along just like watching supporting they were I know, but like security, security.
Sounds kind of hard.
I taught the show.
I would love to know, you've discussed what your perspective is, so perhaps I'd just love to hear someone advocating for one of the particular architectures and giving at least one reason why. So where should we start? Would you like to get us started? Looking for new hands as always. Not a new hand.
I think we had a bit of a discussion about also the timeline of when certain types of approaches might be better or worse. I think one of the things we discussed was that I and other people think that top-down approach right now is not very feasible with the political climate that we have, and that we should therefore focus on more bottom-up cooperation first in order to create also conditions to later have a top-down.
That's a really interesting perspective. So the first point, which is sort of a standard critique, I guess, of the top-down approach, is that it's sort of somehow politically infeasible. I think in one of the readings in this book, it's described as something like good policy, bad politics, or something like that. It's top-down treaty looks well designed, coherent in principle, but may struggle to get over the fact that key countries would just never sign up. And so a bottom-up style treaty might be better at getting moving. And I think you talked about creating a constituency, or did you? Or so creating a pro-climate constituency. So a very good start. Okay. Yes.
We were also talking about how the bottom-up system would kind of account for heterogeneity within countries, because maybe when you pledge something, you're thinking about the generalities, but that might not be able to be applied to all the different people, enterprises, or locations?
Yeah. So it sort of, it works with, it'll end up reflecting within country heterogeneity. I guess the question is that a good thing or a bad thing? So, a sovereign government can in principle compel its citizens and businesses to do something that they don't all want to do, and that can be either pro-climate or anti-climate, depending on which government you've got and which interests you're thinking about, right?
Can I mention a small thing about it?
Yeah.
Like I was thinking more of countries that have stakeholders that I usually not consider, like, I don't know, native communities and groups like that.
Okay, yeah. So kind of sort of representation of marginalized groups, maybe? I mean, yeah, maybe. Sort of regretting writing this down so far on the board. Still got quite a good
We also discussed this hybrid regime, specifically climate clubs. We think that would solve a lot of the problems that we see with the others, because essentially you need something that is, it's not a toothless tiger, you need something that's sort of stable, but that's also in the interest of the participants. Because, like, whilst this might be easier to do, it's very difficult to convince people to do something that hurts themselves. So you need to create the incentive structure that they do something that hurts themselves. That's why we sort of advocated for this climate.
So these are, the Climate Club's paper is in the further readings today if you want to take a look at it. But this is basically the idea of subsets of countries, isn't it? Creating clubs of climate action and sort of linking with things like trade tariffs to actually provide some club goods to make people want to actually join the club. So that I would say, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I would say those are the kind of key features of this idea. Linked with trade access. I think what I would say is that I think both the bottom-up proposal and the hybrid proposal take as their starting point the idea that you struggle to make people do what they don't want to do, right? But they differ principally in the scale at which they then try to work at. So the bottom-up approach works at a very small scale. It can be cities or indigenous groups or grassroots organizations. It can also be investors and things. It doesn't have to be fully hippie, right? But the hybrid one is still often working at the country level. And so one thing I want you to think about when you compare these two proposals is then sort of which one is more scalable more quickly? It's a genuinely open question, but like how can we move fast? Does the answer to that to start at the very bottom in the hope that you'd have to scale a lot from here, but maybe the speed would be high. Starting with climate clubs means you don't have to scale as much because you're already dealing with groups of countries, but maybe we can't go fast enough. That's kind of the way to, I would think, the way to compare these. Yes?
So we were talking about it from a subnational perspective, primarily from like a U.S. view of like states taking action, and we thought that it absolutely would have an immediate effect. So you're talking about ramping it up. You could do things faster the way California or New York does. But then we were talking about how long-term it actually would have like a diminishing effect, because if you got so reliant on that structure, it would actually give more permission for people to remove themselves if there was a more like friendly national scheme for that.
Yeah, so, right, exactly. And one of the ways that I would, I hope everybody heard that, and I think one of the ways, so the bottom-up proposal, it doesn't have any answer to the free rider problem. It sort of says that the free rider problem is there, and there's no way to compare. People are just going to free ride, right? And so we're just going to narrow in on the set of people for whom it's individually rational to start with to act. And then we're going to hope that by acting, they, for example, generate knowledge about how to act effectively, generate examples of things that work, which builds confidence among the initial free riders, that builds trust, and so on. But yes, so the Kyoto-style treaties sort of try to solve the free rider problem through legally binding targets and enforcement mechanisms, and sort of say you must not leave this treaty, otherwise you will be punished. Everybody must sign this treaty. Everybody must take on a target. If you leave, you will be punished. Bottom-up proposals, and to an extent a hybrid proposals, sort of say that you can't punish people effectively. Therefore, we're just going to start by leaving them out, and then we're going to see whether we can create incentives for them to join. In the bottom-up case, it's just through sort of trust, and knowledge, and learning. In the climate clubs, as an example of the hybrid regime, it's more like linked with other goods, so that you can provide a benefit to being in the club, and then take away the free rider incentive that way. Yeah.
Yeah, so the Kyoto is meant to deliver economic effectiveness and economic efficiency, and in Ostrom there isn't a mechanism to ensure that, and in a hybrid regime also very likely to have at least no cost-effective solution. For example, if we divide south and north.
Exactly, and it's an important point. So we've talked at length in the course about the equimarginal principle, about cost effectiveness, and it's not just an economic curiosity, right? If abatement is cheap, it's popular. If abatement is expensive, it's going to be less popular, right? The only one of these proposals that would get close to global cost effectiveness is the Kyoto-style agreement with targets and timetables and market-based instruments, right? It would be at the very bottom-up level. You'll just it's going to be probably far away from that. And yes, over time, you hope that we can kind of build connections and build coalitions, particularly with the hybrid regime. But this, if insofar as we care about efficiency, as I said, also because it matters politically, then this is the only one that's going to do that. Yeah, did you say?
Oh yeah, I have. Well, I was thinking about the main problem with the Ostrom style is that not everyone is up to cooperation because they are not internalizing the benefits of climate change. In the hybrid regime, if you create the correct incentive structure as a government, you can reward the communities that are pro-climate, and also internalize the externality of climate change within the firms of the people that don't want to. I was thinking about how also the government was critical in fostering, for example, solar energy, wind energy, and everything. But it's just like the government role is to get into more a set of current incentives for people to do that, to care about climate and to accomplish the climate goals.
Okay. How should I capture that? I'm genuinely trying to think how I should capture that. Because I often think that the hybrid regime and I've drawn it over here, but I often think of this as more like a spectrum, at a point on the spectrum. And as I said, regarding internalizing the externality, top-down treaty tries to do that, right, by forcing everybody to play the full cooperative solution, basically. The trouble is that you can't. The bottom-up one just says, let's just start with what people would do in their own interest and hope that it generates momentum. So I just wasn't clear what if you were saying something different to that.
No, I was saying exactly that. Specifically in the making the externalities internalized. I think that also there is the thing about legitimacy, and I think that in international cooperation there is no binding rules, so there is no legitimacy to enforce that. But in the hybrid regime, at the national level, there is more chance to do that. Yeah, so I would categorize like mine into between Ostrom and hybrid regime.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But I do think that, you know, probably besides climate clubs and the sorts of things that we talk about in the hybrid regime are like sectoral agreements, for example, aviation, shipping, kind of things like that. And in, you know, so EG, climate clubs, EG, sectoral agreements, and in those regards, there can be more legitimacy, I guess. So that is a useful point that we could take out of it, and that is also true of the bottom up. Yes.
In terms of the Kyoto style, one thing I think it does do that the others don't really is like create at least like a context to address like global issues. For example, like developed countries helping pay for the impacts of climate change on developing countries.
Yes.
I don't think that could really happen in a small scale conversation.
No, I think that's right. So I think that the way in which, you know, even the way in which the Paris Agreement tries to deal with finance actually quite top down. I mean, we've talked about the Paris Agreement is not a perfectly bottom up or hybrid type agreement. It's got some elements of both, but the finance part is kind of tries to do that. So yeah, I think that's a really good point.
It's also kind of the only one which you can be sure that you're aligned with the science on like what temperature you want to.
If you can implement it, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Or like it's the only one that has maybe like pathways to do that.
So it can be science based, yes.
But I think the other ones are harder to make sure that you're actually reducing your emissions.
I mean, you know, you can align with the science at any level, right? So if you think about something like the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is an initiative that gets companies to take on emissions targets that are science-based in the sense of aligned with Paris temperature goals. That is more kind of bottom-up.
Yeah, I guess just like
But-
globally reaching.
Exactly, but it's done at such a small scale that because anybody who's not taking part is not science aligned, then overall you will be, yes.
Maybe this might already be baked into the legitimacy thing, but I think some hybrid regimes are quite good to communicate politically relative to like some others, because you say, okay, we do this, and we also have an upside for it, and if we wouldn't sort of participate, we would have higher trade regimes. And also, like second aspect, it's sort of, it may be, I mean, it doesn't really exist, but it may be more executable because you only would really need like 4 big countries, like if you would have the US, China, and so on.
Well, I mean, and that's like, you know, the whole idea of the hybrid regime is sort of, the idea is kind of, if you have to sign a comprehensive treaty, then you sort of tend towards the lowest common denominator. So if everybody has to agree on a comprehensive treaty, then the set of things that everyone can agree on could be quite small in the end. Whereas if you break it up into a series of sub-treaties, for example, by sectors or subsets of countries, you can increase the amount of action. I think that I think is really very much part of the point of it.
Yeah. I think on the Kyoto style, if it's science-based, it also has to be sort of tracked, and it might be a bit technically difficult because you have to sort of track the CDM additionality or monitor like biological and geological sinks.
Yes, for sure.
So there's like an element of, whereas in trade it's very easy, you can just track the tariffs.
You can, but what I would say is that, so with all of these architectures, transparency, monitoring and verification is a challenge. But I think what I get from a lot of the readings in this area is that the more bottom up you are and the more diversity you have in the way action is expressed, the bigger the challenge in tracking progress. I think that the top-down treaty is the strongest here because it asks, first of all, you're dealing with 200 actors. Each of them is supposed to set an emissions target. Emissions are measurable. We have institutions to do that. It's a little harder for land use than energy, but it's still quite doable. At a very bottom-up level, you could get, it's not the organizations making commitments in the bottom-up. It might not only be emissions. It could be commitments in relation to money or technologies and things like that. And then suddenly you've got a really big problem in measuring progress. And that is why there is much more in the Paris Agreement about that regarding the stock take and stuff than there was in Kyoto, where it was much more just a problem of establishing emissions inventories and measuring emissions. I'm going to take two more points max. So I just want to see if any new hands. Otherwise, I'll turn to a couple of old hands. So yeah.
I would say that the Ostrom style, because it doesn't have a standardization, it can allow for leakage from some people moving from one place to another if they don't like the standard they are enforcing somewhere.
And you see that as a positive?
No.
As a negative?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. So it's as I said, it has no answer for the free rider problem, right? So if somebody wants to defect to bring the game theory language into the Ostrom outcome, they can. But then they sort of can Kyoto as well.
It's probably relatively Kyoto style, but in some essence, countries are making decisions, but they are in of themselves an agglomeration of interest groups.
Oh, yes.
That have to that all are trying to influence and come to an agreement of some kind. When they increase the transparency around who was on different badges to the UN, it turned out there was lots of fossil fuel industry badges on country badges because of things like state enterprises, but then also complex agreements between these actors.
Yes. So
they kind of influence. So is the Kyoto style a bit of a false picture that it's influenced by the bottom up, even if you have a top down system?
Yeah. Is it a false picture, or is it more like everybody understands that nation states are made up of sets of different interests? The question is, what's the right place the right level to focus on action? Some people like Ostrom see the nation state as being almost like a straitjacket, like preventing the pro-climate actors from actually getting on with it. Other people think about the nation state as being the sort of proper place to deliver kind of scalable action and try to bring everybody along. So it's open to interpretation. Let's finish with a show of hands. So how many, if you had to choose between one of these three architectures, how many would vote for Kyoto style? How many would vote for a hybrid regime? And how many would vote for a bottom-up regime? Well, it seems like the hybrid regime has it, perhaps partly because these are two ends of the spectrum, and the hybrid regime sits in between. There's no right answer to this question. There's no architecture which is a solution to all the problems. Okay? So all we can do is think about what might be the best of an imperfect set of options. Okay? That's all for today, and I will see you for the vision session next week. To reiterate, you no need to prepare anything. And if you haven't signed them,
even though I do. Is this the last thing you want to do?
Oh, got for this week?
She was thinking a lot about how like why is this a problem, and then I raised like
Hopefully not.
I thought it might kind of keep moving forward, and they just they find a so that's what I said. You know, you're right.
I think so. It's not feeling amazing, but I'll just stop it.